So I asked you a minute ago, what is a belief? What is a belief? It's something you feel strongly about. But the stronger you feel, the more puzzled you are by someone who has an opposing belief, right? And then to defend your belief, we get defensive. That's what defending means. And then we start blaming other people because they have a different belief. In our culture, don't you think it's fair to say that people associate integrity with the raw, boisterous assertion of belief rather than a kind of deliberation about alternative beliefs? I mean, think about it. Of the two definitions of integrity, which do you think, not what you hold, but which do you think is more prevalent in our culture? That integrity is comprised by sticking to your guns no matter what, raucously asserting your conviction about things, or is it the calm deliberation of alternative beliefs? Deliberation versus boisterous assertion. Which do you think is more common? Boisterous assertion. Okay, so the fierceness with which we express our views in our culture is actually more valued than the willingness to explore, to evaluate the origin of our views. And what this has done it has rendered our culture a nation that's not really communicating with each other, right? This is what we're seeing all around us. And the participants don't seem to mind that. The consequences of it are dangerous, as we all see, but people don't seem to care as long as they're right. So one of the challenges of integrity is that deliberation, which is the cornerstone of it, cannot compete with the juggernaut of emotion. And what's happened is that we've become a community that's not interested in the truth, but just interested in getting our voice heard. In fact, we're so out of practice telling the truth that we don't even know how to handle it. It's like Jack Nicholson said, we can't handle the truth. We all respect it, but the way we seek it is through the assertion of belief. Belief has become a substitute for truth. That's not what we'd like to think, and it's not like many of us in this room act, but that's the trajectory of belief. It descends into blame. So, now's the question. What does that have to do with the 5 questions I asked you? Okay. What is this belief blame epidemic that we all notice around us have to do with 5 simple questions? Okay, so I'm going to give you an answer. Well, this is what I think it has to do with. I think what we think of when we answer questions like that is this consequential? Is this act really something that matters? Is our word or our deed important in this context? Now, you can probably figure out where I'm going because I wrote a book, The Law of Small Things. And the question is, and you're going to get a copy, did I mention that?
Fine.
Okay, a couple of times? Okay, maybe I've overstepped integrity by. So the question that we really have to face, I mean, as county officials, as human beings who serve as county officials. I know some of your colleagues you don't regard as human beings, but the that's right. Believe me, I've been there. But that's part of integrity too. But I think so. The question is there anything that we do or say that can ever be described as unimportant? Is there anything that we do or say that can be described as inconsequential or too small to matter? So that's the law of small things. Now let me describe how the law works. Let's take the white lie. Now, most of you, and it was very encouraging to see this, think that the white lie is a breach of integrity. You don't think it's too small to matter. Okay, that's great. But I think we're surrounded in the culture that does that. So here's the question. If our culture condones something as small as lying about canceling a lunch date, why should we expect the President of the United States to tell the truth? It's not a trivial question because the root is the same. The perpetrator of the lie has to come up with a story to excuse the lie. So you get to the question of whether a white lie or Watergate is that different in its essential nature. It may only be distinguished by the complexity of the story that's being told to excuse the lie. Now, a lot of people say to me when I give this talk, this is a great audience, or you county officials, you understand the value of your word. And that's great to see in your responses. Believe me, these responses vary. But a lot of people say, but a white lie is meaningless, it's just inconsequential. I'll be ready for the big things. You can count on me. You can vote for me. I'll be ready. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story that unfolded on a mountain. So this is a true story, and it happened on Mount Everest. Okay, so about 14 years ago, it was made into a movie. 40 climbers passed up a distressed climber on the mountain. In other words, someone who was really in extreme condition. 40 of them passed him up. But what I mean by that is that some of them might have given him a blanket or given him some oxygen for a few minutes, or dug a little snow cave for him, all right, or give him water or something. But no one took the responsibility to get him down to the base camp where he could be attended to medically. And he died. So Sir Edmund Hillary, does everybody know who he is? He was the first climber on Everest. At the time, before he died, he was the most famous mountaineer in the world. And he was outraged, in part because a number of those climbers who passed up the distressed climber were New Zealanders, and that's where he's from. And he said, when I was on Everest, as badly as I wanted to get up that mountain, the summit is very secondary to saving a life. Can't argue with that. But 40 people passed him up. If you had asked those 40 people, when it comes to saving a life, is there anything more important? And they would say, no, of course not. Saving a life is the most important thing. But they left it to someone else. They left it to someone else to do. So the point here is that when you look at things, we live in a culture, and this is a critical integrity point, we live in a culture that leaves it to other people to do things. Now think about what happened in 2007, I was about to retire from my job as a lawyer. As you can see, I'm not retired, although maybe some of you would think that based on my comments about integrity. But and my portfolio suffered, and maybe yours did too. Why? Because millions of individuals sought loans that they couldn't afford, but they left it to the banks to clean up. They left it to somebody else to clean up. And what about the investment bankers that made securities out of these terrible loans? Well, they left it to the government to sort out. And it kept going down the line. The insurance company, we don't have the money, but let's do it anyway, and the rating agencies. Okay, so we have a culture that leaves it to somebody else. On the big things, like the efficacy of the government and of our financial system. Okay, and how about advertisers who leave it to us to sift through their inflated product claims? It's ridiculous to watch that, isn't it? And how about politicians, not in this room, not county, but politicians in Washington who leave it to us to sift through their exaggerated boasts? I'm not talking about the president. I'm talking about a lot of people who do that. And how about motorists who leave it to others to be more cautious because they're busy texting? Or people in workplaces who leave it to others to report sexual harassment because they don't want to get involved. So we have this culture of leaving it to others. So if we're not ready for the big things, how do we get ready for the big things if we don't practice with the small things? So that's really the question. Now, to practice integrity, is not easy because we have to break through certain patterns of thinking things are small, inconsequential, we'll be ready for the big things. You know, but we don't think about what constitutes a big thing. The big thing is right in front of you. Like when you walk into your county offices and you see a pile of papers and you're groaning because you're never going to get through it. And you ask yourself, is this what my job has come down to? Sifting through applications or paperwork or briefs or drafts, and you don't even know why you got into public service anymore. But what is going on in that small thing is a reflection of the biggest thing, which is serving a democracy, the greatest experience in democracy in the history of the world. So by training ourselves to look at what a small thing is in reflection of a big thing, well, that's an exercise in integrity. Always understanding how powerful it is what we do in small ways. You know, integrity is very hard. I know people say just do it, and I made a joke about that, and I think we all laughed about just do it, like a Nike commercial. But it's really hard, because when you really think about it, avoiding embarrassment is really what integrity is for most people, just staying out of trouble. So I'm going to give you an example of that. Like Warren Buffett, who we admire. Do we admire Warren Buffett? I mean, he's a cultural icon, so there are some hands. So here's his definition of integrity. He said, when you contemplate an act, try to imagine that what you're doing or what you're about to do is on the front page of the newspaper the next day, read by your family, your kids, your spouse, and your friends. And then decide whether you'd want to go ahead and do it. Now, I just want to ask, how many of you think that that's a good rule of thumb? And how many of you think that that doesn't quite get at what integrity is? So who thinks it's a good rule of thumb? Okay, all right. I think you know where I'm coming from, so because you know I'm going to shoot it down, but still, a lot of you have the courage, the integrity, to say that it's a good rule of thumb, and it is. But here's the problem. It's turning integrity on its head. So instead of thinking about what your promises are, your promises to constituents, your explicit undertakings, your implied responsibilities as a person prominent in the community, in your family, in the country, instead of thinking about duty, what are you thinking about? Embarrassment. Embarrassment is the third rail. Embarrassment, punishment, guilt, right? Okay. Stigma. And that's what he's getting at. And when I saw that, I was thinking, well, it's, we look at it uncritically because it makes sense. Why would you want something you do to show up on the front page? But that's not really what integrity is about. When you think about the language we use commonly, like cliches, I call that the vernacular of self-interest. A lot of our cliches habituate us to treat self-interest above duty. I'm going to give you some examples, then you can give me some. Like, no harm, no foul. Okay? You snooze, you lose. Looking out for number one. You can't fight City Hall. It's just business. Fake it till you make it. Now, ever since I started working in this arena, I'm not going to mention again that I wrote a book about this, but I started paying attention to this. And actually, I point out that the Eskimos have 40 words for snow. You've heard that? They have like every type of snow you can imagine. And what do we have? We have one word. But we have more than 40 words for how to substitute self-interest for duty. And that's rampant in the culture. Another thing that we do in our culture is we break promises. Like, how do you feel when someone gets on the phone, you make a call to the credit card company or something, somebody answers and says, not somebody, but a machine, Your calls are very important to us.
Yeah. How important are they?
How important are they? But, you know, that's part of promise breaking. What about politicians who decide that, I hope I'm not offending anybody in this room, but I don't mind if I'm offending somebody outside this room. Maybe that's an integrity question. But there is a very prominent example of this that I'm sure you can recall. Promised not to run after serving 2 terms, and then said, well, I'd really like to be mayor of the city of New York, another term. And so he breached his promise and he did it. Okay? But we do it too. And we make copies of CDs. Does anybody listen to those anymore? DVDs, backdate stock options. We say, well, we'll get right back to you, when we don't really mean that. Let's have lunch. So it's the idleness of language that's part of our struggle.